Nonprofit HR has a rich 20-year history of staying ahead of emerging trends.
Yeah. But we wanted to just spend today talking about the results of our COVID-19 survey. We surveyed some 800 plus organizations across the country. They represent actually 43 states, and you'll see that there are only 5 states that are in light blue. Those are the states for which we had no representation in the survey. But they really represented a broad diversity of organizations, everything from environmental organizations to animal welfare, arts and culture, human services. The list goes on and on. So we have a very good representation of feedback. In terms of those types of organizations that have participated, we had organizations of varying sizes, but the predominant representation comes from those nonprofits with a staff size between 21 and 50. You'll also notice, though, that there's a fairly healthy representation of survey respondents in larger nonprofits. And so you can figure out where you fit and where your organization fits in all of that. Next slide. In terms of budget size, we saw the strongest representation from the smaller segment of nonprofits, those with operating budgets between 1 and just under 5 million. So we had 30% of survey respondents coming from that segment. But you'll notice that we have roughly 12% coming from larger nonprofits, and then another roughly 25% or so coming from mid-sized nonprofits. So again, figure out where you fall into the range of organizations, but we think this represents a very good cross-section of organizations participating in the survey. So let's get into the content. One of the things that we learned is that most organizations at this point have accommodated remote work, working from home for all of their staff. Some 69% of organizations so that they can represent. And what we learned more importantly is that that same number of organizations are now contemplating remote work as a longer term option, which prior to this survey, that number was considerably less. And what we're seeing from this is the new future of work, right? Where organizations have perhaps in the past said, we absolutely can't do it. Everyone needs to be present and visible. We're recognizing, many organizations are recognizing that they can in fact operate remotely, even if it's in a staggered way. So this, I think, will represent a permanent change, a longer term change. And there are all kinds of cultural implications for contemplating remote work as a longer term option. We'll talk about that later on today. We had some really good quotes from survey participants that we wanted to share. And again, you'll note that they're coming from very different spaces. On screen, you'll see a small civil rights organization, less than $1 million budget, located in New York, and their perception of how remote work has worked for them. The fact that they made it an early determination that working from home was appropriate. Of course, we know that New York started as the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis. And then we heard from an organization in Colorado, which actually has a very different approach around stay at home, and the fact that their organization was among one of the first to develop and implement a work from home plan, even though their state may not have been an early adopter, right, in terms of requesting that people stay home. So we saw a lot of diversity in feedback. And we just wanted to share that with you here. So what did we learn about headcounts? Some of you may recall during the recession of 2008, 2009, a large number of nonprofits went out of business. They first laid off staff and then they subsequently closed their doors. And so what we wanted to do was gauge how this crisis was different. And what we heard was that there's some growth in the sector coming as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, right? But we also know that there's some loss or some attrition in terms of organization size. And so what you're looking at right now is a quick depiction of the movement that is expected in the nonprofit sector, those who participated in the survey. 9% of those who responded said that they're they've already experienced an increase in their staff size, right? And there are all kinds of organizations that fall into this space. But as you can imagine, social and human services is one of the areas that we're seeing more growth than in other areas, largely because uh, social and human service organizations are often safety net organizations and are providing critical services during this particular time. We also know that some 10% of organizations, while they have not yet experienced an increase, expect to increase their staff size, again, largely due to demand on their services. 42% of those survey respondents indicated that they're not expecting to either grow or shrink, but instead they're not expecting any change in the the foreseeable future. What's interesting is that there's a bit of a net loss in terms of nonprofit workforce, according to their survey results, with 20% of organizations having already experienced a decrease in staff. And as you'll note here, we have an organization who's indicated that they already laid off 50% of their staff. We know that for that organization and any other that has seen a large decrease in headcount, there are all kinds of service implications, program implications, potentially even funding implications that could have been the driver for some of these organizations decreasing their headcounts. And we also know that there will be cultural implications, right, and benefits implications around this decrease. We also heard that 18% of organizations that participated in the survey, while they have not yet decreased their headcount, are expecting to do that. And what we're hearing is that the longer this crisis continues, the more likely it is that these organizations are likely to face a decrease in headcount. So not sure where you find yourself on the spectrum, but in any of these scenarios, you'll see that these organizations are expecting some dynamic change. So we asked the question of survey participants about what led them to implement a stay-at-home policy for their organization. Were they driven by local mandates, state mandates, or no mandates? There are very few states in the country that didn't have any stay-at-home requirements, or they were very short-lived. And what we heard was that 85% of survey respondents made their decisions to work at home and to go remote based on what their state was mandating. We know some of the most visible governors include Governor Cuomo, who has had daily briefings about his activity, and the states adjoining New York have really gotten into lockstep with each other about their state requirements, which has led many organizations to follow suit, right? Here in the District of Columbia, for example, we closed down back in March, early March, and our organization, which is located in the district, made our decision based on the directives of the mayor and the CDC. So we were driven, in the district, we're a little unique. We're driven both by local and state. In our case, we're not really a state, but in our case, we fall into both categories. Next slide. So we know that many of you are direct service organizations, and we wanted to understand a little bit better how this stay-at-home order and remote work was impacting organizations that were both direct service and non-direct service. So of survey participants, 63% describe themselves as direct service organizations. In other words, community-facing organizations where you're providing direct service to the communities in which you're located. 37% of you are not direct service organizations. And so the assumption is that if you're not direct service, going remote is so much easier. But what we learned was that 60% of direct service organizations and 88% of non-direct service organizations indicated the ability to accommodate remote work for staff. Not surprising entirely. What was surprising to us is the high number of those direct service organizations that were able to provide remote support to staff. And then, of course, 67% of direct service, and 73% of non-direct service are now contemplating a remote work as a model. That 67% for direct service is higher than we anticipated. And what it's telling us is that organizations are quickly adapting to the new normal, one, to continue offering the services that they provide, but in a way that is compliant with the regulations in their particular jurisdictions. Next slide. We asked a couple of other questions to help us understand what level of preparedness organizations had going into the COVID-19 crisis. And what we learned was 65% of respondents had a business continuity plan, and 73% developed an employee communications plan in response to COVID, which is very good, right? That reflects agility and resilience and responsiveness to the crisis. What is concerning is that there are 35% of organizations that don't have a business continuity plan. And so in a case like this, where the crisis kind of came on us very quickly, those organizations are likely to flounder a little bit to figure out how they're going to continue their operations without a formal plan. And so if you're in a position to influence that decision, know that there's a smaller percentage now of organizations that operate without a business continuity plan versus the majority of those that do. So if you're in that minority, you can use this data point as something to beefing up your argument for having one. I was really glad to see the high percentage of organizations that developed an employee communications plan out of COVID-19. Everything that we saw and everything that we guided our clients around was communicate, communicate, communicate. With the high level of uncertainty that came at the beginning of this crisis, communicating with staff frequently for many organizations was a way to minimize some of the uncertainty that folks were feeling. So we were encouraged to see as many organizations as this develop a crisis plan, a communications plan out of this crisis. A little less compelling or encouraging when it comes to succession planning. And here, when we talk about succession plan, we're really talking about what's your plan in the event that you have a leader or someone in your organization leave. Do you have a plan to fill that role? And what we learned is that only 15% of organizations have succession plans for both staff and leadership. A larger percentage, 36%, only have it for leadership, and some 49% have no succession plan at all. One of the learning opportunities out of this crisis is the need for some sort of tangible plan that guides your organization through moving people in and up the organization in the event of a crisis. For example, if your ED or your CEO had become ill, did you have a plan for replacing that individual? And what we heard was only 36% of organizations did, which is troubling, right? Unless you have a very strong leadership team that works very collaboratively together, and many organizations don't have that kind of a rhythm in their leadership team, having some sort of succession plan is really critical in a time of crisis. And so if nothing else, use this as an opportunity, this crisis as an opportunity to put some legs and some meat on your succession plan so that if there's a recurrence in the future, you've got a plan in place. We just wanted to kind of share some of the insights and sentiments that we heard from survey respondents. I think many of you will be able to relate to the experiences of others, and we just thought that would be helpful. We will be sharing this deck following today's session, and so you'll be able to take a look at these insights and get a better sense for what people were experiencing. And then finally, we just want to remind you that we have an entire series of webinars that you can take advantage of. I think we produced some 9 webinars as part of our coronavirus webinar series. They're available on our website at nonprofithr.com/COVID-19. So you're certainly welcome to access those. And this part of the presentation has been recorded for today. The breakout sessions will not be, but if you need to refer to today's presentation, it will be available. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alicia. We'll take a few questions, and then we'll move into our breakout. Alicia?
Thanks, Lisa. If anybody has a general question, please feel free to put it in the chat box before we break out into breakout rooms. We're just doing a little reshuffling based on attendees, so be happy to see if there are any general questions that maybe we can answer. So please type those into the chat box, sorry. And in a few minutes, we are going to move to breakout rooms where we will have conversations on one of the topics that were mentioned when you registered. We did try to base those on your preferences, but also on space availability and allocating them appropriately. You can swap between rooms if you decide to. That is an option. And one thing we are going to do is have a come back together as a big group and share some of the key takeaways. So we are going to do that, so everybody will have the advantage of hearing what is discussed in each group as well. And then we'll also wrap up with any final information. So let me see, was there something, did I just, whoops, sorry. I think I see something in the chat, so 1 second, let me get there. I keep clicking myself out for some reason. Angela, can you read me the question in the chat, please? Oh, actually, I got
There's no question. It's actually, I just put the link for the COVID resources in the chat box. You're welcome.
Yeah, so Lisa was referring to all the resources we have on our webinars, and we also have a lot of COVID resources that we have been putting together. And you can see in the chat that website address at nonprofithr.com/COVID-19. That houses a lot of information that we have been compiling over this time, very helpful resources and links for you.
I do see a question now, Alicia. The question that we asked on the survey about organizations contemplating longer-term remote arrangements, did that specify whether it's full-time remote or part-time remote?
It actually didn't. We didn't ask that question. And so we don't have data to give you one way or the other. But the fact that so many organizations are now contemplating remote work as a longer term solution, we think is a very good thing. A lot of kind of the workforce has moved in this direction, particularly organizations that are not direct facing. Obviously retail is limited, and some other segments of the industries are limited, but many employees are looking for employers that will extend a measure of flexibility to them, including the option to work remotely, even if it's not 5 days a week. And so the fact that more and more organizations are progressing toward this practice, we think is a good thing, because it will allow them to be more competitive, quite honestly. Now, we're in a very different market than we were 3 months ago. 3 months ago, we were in a very tight labor market where flexibility was not really a negotiating factor anymore. People saw that as essential. With the workforce being very different and the unemployment rate being much higher, it may be that some organizations can go back to not offering remote work as an option, but we suspect that more and more will realize that their organizations can be productive with a remote work option.
Okay, great. If I don't see, is there one more question?
I see another question. It is, we have a small full-time staff of 3 with different roles. Do you have suggestions for succession planning in that structure?
The principles of the great question. The principles of succession planning are the same regardless of size, right? It's the identification of critical roles and tasks that need to happen at each level in an organization. Some only do it for leadership. In the case of having only 3 people, I would do it for all. Identify what those key roles are and who might fill them in the event of an emergency. So for example, if your executive director were to become ill, would the next person in line step in, or would it be someone from the board? Consequently, if that person moved into the ED role, who would take that individual's position, and what key skills and responsibilities would be needed to do that? So that's an example of how it could work even for a small nonprofit. Obviously, if you're larger, you have more talent to draw from internally. But if you're a smaller organization, many smaller organizations rely on board members to step in on an interim basis in the event of particularly a crisis or an emergency. When it's planned transition, then that's a little bit different. They might engage a search firm, they might engage a consultant, someone to help them think through the future of their organization from a talent perspective. I hope that's helpful.